Number 10. Miyamoto Musashi, April 13th, 1612. A small strip of beach called Ganru-jima between the Japanese islands of Honshu and Kyushu. Sasaki Kojiro, one of the greatest swordsmen in Japan, has been standing in the sun for hours waiting for his opponent to arrive. Kojiro is a master of a technique called the swallow's tail. Cut a downward stroke so fast his contemporaries considered it nearly unanswerable. He carries a sword called the drying pole, an unusually long nadachi that gives him reach on almost anyone he faces. Witnesses stand at a respectful distance. Officials pace, the morning has stretched into afternoon, and Miyamoto Musashi has not shown up. When a boat finally slides onto the sand, Musashi steps off holding not a sword, but a piece of wood. He has carved it from the boat's oar during the crossing. He has cut it a few inches longer than Kojiro's blade. Kojiro is beside himself with fury. He draws his sword and hurls the scabbard into the surf. Musashi is said to have looked at the water and told him that if he no longer had use for his scabbard, he was already a dead man. The fight took seconds. Kojiro's drying pole came down and clipped the cloth around Musashi's head. Musashi's oar came down on Kojiro's skull. By some accounts, the wooden weapon crushed his ribs so hard he passed out and died shortly after. By others, his head simply caved in. Musashi walked back to the boat and rowed away. This was one duel. Musashi fought 61 of them. He was never once defeated. Miyamoto Musashi was born around 1584 in Harima Province. His first duel came at 13 when a wandering samurai of the Shinto Ryu school named Arima Kihei hosted a public challenge in his village. Kihei was a grown man and an experienced swordsman. Musashi was a boy. Musashi answered the challenge, beat him to death with a wooden staff, and never looked back. By his 20s, he had cut a path across Japan, taking on every school and every master who would meet him. He fought the Yoshioka family in Kyoto in a series of duels that ended the Yoshioka style of swordsmanship as an institution. He beat spearmen. He beat chain and sickle fighters. He beat men with longer blades, shorter blades, and blades that were considered unbeatable. He may have fought as a teenager at Sekigahara in 1600, the great battle we have covered in another video, though. The sources are not clear on which side he was on or whether he actually swung a sword that day. He achieved all of this using two ideas that most swordsmen of his time considered heresy. The first was that armor was a psychological crutch for men who did not trust their own technique. He often removed his own for duels. The second was that the weapon in your hand mattered less than the mind behind it. He killed men with wooden swords. He killed men with sticks. He killed a master swordsman with a boat oar. He liked to arrive late to duels because irritated men make mistakes. He liked to be underestimated because underestimated men win. His style eventually became known as Niten Ichi Ryu. The school of the two heavens is one, and it centered on a technique most other schools thought was impossible. He fought with a sword in each hand. Here is what makes Musashi haunting rather than merely impressive. In an age when the highest expression of samurai skill was to serve a great lord and die well in his name, Musashi refused all of it. He never took a permanent master. He never married. Sources suggest he rarely bathed. He walked from town to town for decades looking for people who might be better than him, and he did not find any. And then, in his early 60s, having proved everything he ever set out to prove, he stopped. He went to a cave on the island of Kyushu called Reigen-do. He sat down and he wrote. What came out of that cave in the last years of his life was Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings. It is one of the most influential treatises on strategy ever produced by any culture. Executives in Tokyo read it today. Generals in the United States military read it today. Athletes read it today. Musashi did not just win his fights. He sat down at the end and explained exactly how he did it, so anyone with the discipline to listen could learn. The record has to be handled with care. The number 61 comes from Musashi himself, from that same book, and a first-person memoir is not the same as an audited transcript. But several of the individual duels are corroborated by independent samurai chronicles, including the Ganru-jima fight and the Yoshioka duels. What is not in dispute is that Musashi walked away from every fight he entered and died of natural causes at 62. That is not something you say about many people who lived by the sword in feudal Japan. Musashi was a one-man army because he had turned himself into a laboratory of combat. Every duel was an experiment, every survival was data. By the end, he had learned everything a sword could teach a human being. Then, he set it down and walked into a cave to write it out. There is nothing else in world history quite like him. Number 9, Pierre Gerlofs Donia. In the summer of 1515, in a small farming village on the coast of Frisia called Kimswerd, soldiers riding under the black banner of the Habsburg Emperor's mercenaries burned a farmhouse and killed the woman inside. The farmer was not home. His name was Pierre Gerlofs Donia. When he came back and buried what was left of his wife, he lifted a two-handed sword taller than most of his neighbors, walked down to the sea, and started the war that would consume the North Sea coast for the next 5 years. The Frisians called him Groot Pierre, Big Pierre. Everyone else learned to call him a nightmare. The tradition says Pierre stood 7 feet tall in a period when the average Frisian man barely cleared 5.5. It says he could grip the reins of a horse in one hand and lift the horse's front legs off the ground. It says his voice carried across a battlefield without amplification and that he could take a helmeted head clean off with a single stroke of his sword. It says that when he defeated 300 Hollanders at Hindelopen, he made every survivor recite a Frisian tongue twister and cut down the ones whose pronunciation gave them away as Dutch or German infiltrators. The phrase was butter, brea, and green ceus, butter, bread, and green cheese. If you could not say it in a proper Frisian accent, you were not a real Frisian and Big Pierre's sword came down. These are legends. The historical Pierre is thinner. Court records, Habsburg administrative reports, and the chronicles of the coastal towns he tormented confirm that he existed, that he led a Frisian uprising between 1515 and 1519, and that his rebel fleet captured 11 Habsburg ships in a naval engagement near Hoorn in 1518. They confirm that he took the war to sea, raiding, sinking, and burning until Charles V of Habsburg had to redirect real military resources north to deal with him. They confirm that his war ended not with defeat, but with exhaustion. In 1519, he retired to the town of Sneek. Disillusioned with the endless bloodletting, he died in his bed on October 28th of the following year at around 40 and was buried in the Groot Kirk at Sneek. And there's one more piece of evidence that is neither legend nor court record. It is metal. Inside the Fries Museum in Leeuwarden, in a glass case, there is a sword. It is 7 feet long. The blade is nicked and worn in the way blades get when they have actually been used, not just displayed. The scholars who examined it identified it as a German-made Zweihander, of the correct period, meaning Pierre probably took it off a Saxon soldier he killed. The goatskin wrapping on the grip is stained with something older than rust. It is a real weapon that a real man swung. Whether he could really take multiple heads with a single stroke, the way the ballads insist, is a story. That he was strong enough to swing a sword taller than most men could lift, and that he swung it at the empire that killed his wife, is not a story. It is a fact. Pierre Gerlofs Donia is a one-man army in a very specific sense. He was not a general. He was not a warlord. He was a farmer whose grief metabolized into a personal military campaign that put a Holy Roman Emperor's court to serious inconvenience for the better part of 5 years. The image the Frisians kept was of a single giant on a beach, water dripping off his boots, a sword like a fence post in his hand, wading toward men who had convinced themselves the emperor's authority would protect them. His campaign did not free Frisia. Charles V eventually reimposed Habsburg rule, and modern Friesland is a province of the Netherlands, not an independent country. But Groot Pierre bought his region 5 years in which the empire could not act unopposed. He did it with a small crew of rebels and a sword nobody else could swing. His grave is still marked. His weapon is still on display. And in Frisia, when someone wants to say that a man is dependable, they still sometimes measure him against Big Pierre. Number 8. Götz of the Iron Hand, 1504. A siege in southern Germany. A 24-year-old imperial knight named Gottfried von Berlichingen is fighting for the Duke of Bavaria beneath the walls of Landshut. He wears the sword arm of every knight of his generation, trained since boyhood, comfortable in armor, comfortable in the saddle, comfortable in the mathematics of edged combat. A cannonball fired from the walls comes in wrong. Accounts disagree on the exact geometry. Some say the ball struck the hilt of his own sword and drove the blade sideways through his arm. Others say the ball itself carried the arm away. It does not really matter. When Götz was pulled off the field, his right arm ended at the wrist, and the field surgeons finished the amputation with what they had. A knight without a sword hand was a knight without a career. Götz was 24. He would not accept it. He remembered, during his convalescence, seeing a one-handed servant in his father's household who had lived a full life anyway. That memory got him out of the pit. He walked down to a village blacksmith and commissioned something no one had really made before. He wanted an iron hand, not a decoration, a working hand, something that could grip a sword and hold reins and function on a horse. The blacksmith and a saddle maker built him the first version. It was a hollow iron glove with fingers that could be curled inward on hinges and locked into a grip position with a pin released by a push button. The details were absurdly fine for the period. The blacksmith carved knuckle wrinkles and even fingernails into the metal. It was as much a work of grim vanity as of engineering. The first hand worked. Götz went back to war. He fought for the next 40 years wearing it. Around 1530, in his early 50s, he commissioned a second iron hand from a gunsmith who was clearly showing off. The second version is the one you can still see today in the museum at his old castle at Hornburg. It has segmented fingers that can be moved into different positions and locked with ratchet mechanisms borrowed from flintlock design. It could hold a sword, it could hold a quill, it could grip the reins of a warhorse. Physicians from across Europe traveled to see it. It is one of the founding artifacts in the history of prosthetic engineering, and it was built because a stubborn German knight refused to accept that a cannonball had ended his life at 24. Götz used those 40 additional years the way you might expect. He fought as a mercenary for whichever prince or duke was paying. He led feuds. He raided merchant convoys and demanded ransoms. When the German Peasants' War broke out in 1525, he ended up briefly leading a peasant army, though whether he did it out of sympathy or under duress is still debated. He was captured and imprisoned by the emperor more than once. He was excommunicated. He was fined enormous sums. None of it stopped him. He kept riding, kept raiding, and kept coming home to Hornburg Castle to sleep it off. He also wrote his memoirs. In them, he reported delivering to a demanding official a phrase that has never quite left the German language. He told the man he could kiss his backside. The exact three-word Middle High German version of that sentence became so famous that Germans today refer to it as the Swabian salute, and it is still used, unaltered, as a socially recognized insult 500 years later. The playwright Goethe would later write a full 5-act drama about Götz cementing him in German literature as the folk hero of individual defiance against overwhelming authority. Existentialist writers reached for him as a symbol. Blues rock bands took his name. He is one of the very few knights of the late medieval period who is still a household reference. Götz died at 81 in his bed on July 23, 1562. The Iron Hand was still with him. He had outlived nearly everyone he ever fought. What makes Götz a one-man army is not that he was the greatest swordsman of his day. He was not. There were better duelists. What made him a one-man army was refusal at an almost cellular level. A cannonball took his sword hand. He built a new one out of iron and kept riding. Emperors imprisoned him. He got out and kept riding. Peasants and princes tried to use him and discard him. He kept riding. For 4 decades, if you were an official in the Holy Roman Empire and word came that Götz of the Iron Hand was in your district again, you had a very specific problem. Not an army. Not a rebellion. One aging knight with an iron fist and no ability to be discouraged. That was enough. Number 7. Galvarino. The Arauco War, fought between the Mapuche people of what is now southern Chile and the Spanish Empire, is one of the longest single conflicts in the history of the Americas. It began in the 1530s and did not truly end until the 1880s. In the middle of it, in November 1557, one of the fiercest generations of Mapuche fighters was still trying to hold the line against the conquistador governor Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza. The greatest of the young Mapuche warlords of that generation was Lautaro, whose short and terrifying career against the Spanish at Tucapel we have covered in our video on teenage warlords. The war continued after him, and Out of that continuation walked a man who redefined what could be done with a wound. At the Battle of Lagunias on the 8th of November, 1557, the Spanish routed a Mapuche force near the Bio River and took 150 prisoners. Among them was a young warrior named Galvarino. Mendoza, the governor, did not execute them. He wanted to make an example that would ripple through every village on the frontier. He ordered his soldiers to cut off the right hand and slice off the nose of every captive. For leaders like Galvarino, he ordered both hands severed, then he ordered them released so they could walk home carrying his message on their bodies. The Mapuche tradition says Galvarino did not flinch. It says that when the Spanish soldier took his left hand off with a hatchet, Galvarino calmly extended his right for the second cut. Whether that specific detail is embroidery or eyewitness fact, the outcome is documented. Galvarino walked back to his people. He asked them to lash blades to the ends of his arms. Some accounts say they used knives. Some say they used short native swords. The image is the same either way. Where his hands had been, there were now blades. And where the Spanish had expected a broken man carrying a warning, they got a war leader carrying a specific promise about what he intended to do next. Less than a month after his mutilation, Galvarino stood at the front of roughly 3,000 Mapuche warriors preparing to attack Mendoza's encampment at Milarapué. The plan was an ambush. It went wrong. The Mapuche sprang their trap too early. The Spanish were able to bring their cannons and their cavalry to bear before the ambushing infantry could reach the tents. Records from the Spanish side say Galvarino was seen at the front waving his men forward with his bladed arms, shouting a version of the sentence that later became the most famous thing anyone attributed to him. Nobody is allowed to run. To die defending your homeland is not defeat. The Spanish chronicler Geronimo de Vivar preserved a version of that speech. The battle went catastrophically for the Mapuche. Around 3,000 of them were killed. The Spanish suffered almost no losses beyond dead horses. Several hundred Mapuche prisoners were taken, and Galvarino was among them again. This time there was no mutilation and release. According to the sources, he was hanged, though not before he reached a Spanish vice commander with his bladed stumps and killed him. The blades did what the hands could not. Galvarino's story is not the story of a man who won his battle. He did not win it. He died in Spanish custody hours after being recaptured. What Galvarino accomplished, sitting in a chair almost 500 years later, is harder to measure but more important. He kept his people fighting. The war he was part of would go on for centuries. The Aztecs of central Mexico fell in 2 years. The Incas of Peru fell in a generation. The Mapuche never fully fell. They fought the Spanish to a stalemate that lasted until the 19th century, and they still live in Chile today, as a distinct people with their own language and their own memory. Galvarino is one of the reasons why. He turned an intended message of surrender into a myth of refusal. He walked into a battlefield with knives tied to his arms and told his people that what had been done to him could be done to any of them if they stopped fighting. The image is one of the most disturbing in the entire history of colonial resistance. It is also one of the most effective pieces of political theater any indigenous leader has ever staged. The Mapuche remember him. Statues of him stand in Chile. The Chilean Navy named a warship for him. His face appears on murals and in school books. He was not the greatest warrior in the war. Lautaro was probably better. Copolacan was probably better. Galvarino ranks with them because of what he did with a wound that should have ended him. He turned amputation into a weapon. He turned a warning into a rallying cry. He was a one-man army because he made every other Mapuche who saw him understand that surrender was not a survival strategy, only a slower death. Number 6, Bertrand du Guesclin. Around 1320, in a small manor house near Dinan in Brittany, a baby was born to a minor Breton noble family, and by every surviving account, he was extraordinarily ugly. The Trouvère Scuvelier, who wrote the earliest verse chronicle of his life, said flatly that Bertrand was the ugliest child anywhere between Rennes and Dinan. He was short, he had short bandy legs, he had a huge round head, his skin was described as black like a wild boar's, and his shoulders were said to be too wide for the rest of his body. His own mother reportedly gave up on him and gave preferential treatment to his younger brothers. Bertrand's response to all of this was to grow up into the most dangerous man in France. His personal motto in later life was translated as "Courage gives what beauty refuses." He fought his first serious combat at the Siege of Rennes in 1356, when the English besieged the city and Bertrand slipped in and out of the walls smuggling supplies. But the incident that made his name was a judicial duel. His brother Olivier had been captured by an English knight named Sir Thomas of Canterbury, who demanded an enormous ransom for the boy's release. Bertrand did not pay it. He challenged Canterbury to a duel in the market square of Dinan and got the Duke of Lancaster himself to oversee it. Canterbury came in full armor. Bertrand shed most of his own armor for speed, closed with Canterbury on foot, and drove the pommel of his dagger into his opponent's face until Canterbury's men had to physically pull Bertrand off him to prevent a killing. Canterbury released Olivier without ransom. Bertrand kept his brother, kept his reputation, and got the tradition of eating dinner mid-siege on the rubble that would follow him around for the rest of his life. He liked to eat surrounded by wreckage. He liked the taste of victory served on the ruins of what had just been an English holding. He came out of Brittany into the service of King Charles V of France in 1364. The French crown had a very specific problem at that moment. It had lost battle after battle to English longbowmen. The chivalric tradition of the French nobility, all glory and pitched charges, had been dismantled at Crécy and Poitiers. Charles needed someone who did not care about chivalry and did care about winning. Bertrand du Guesclin cared about winning. He preferred to avoid pitched battles when he could, refuse sieges he could not win, and specialized in wearing the English down through raids, ambushes, and starvation. When he did fight pitched battles, he won 5 of the 7 in which he had command. When he was captured, which happened repeatedly, his ransoms were so extortionate that the English were nearly bankrupted trying to keep him locked up. Both King Charles V of France and King Henry II of Castile paid enormous sums to get him back into the field. His campaign in Spain in the 1360s inserted him into one of the most vicious civil wars of the century. He fought at the Battle of Nájera in 1367 and was captured by the Black Prince. He was ransomed back. He returned and won the Battle of Montiel in 1369, putting Henry of Trastamara on the Castilian throne. What happened inside a tent immediately after that battle, when Henry and his half-brother Pedro settled the war with knives, is a story we have told in full in our video on brothers who tried to murder each other for a crown. Bertrand collected a Castilian dukedom for his trouble and rode back to France. In May 1370, Charles V of France appointed him Constable of France. This was the highest military office in the kingdom. The ugliest child from Rennes de Dinan now commanded the armed forces of the most powerful state in Western Europe. Over the next 10 years, he reconquered Poitou, Guyenne, and Auvergne from the English. He recovered whole provinces that had been lost after Poitiers. When he died in 1380, in the middle of yet another siege in the south of France, the English position in France had been reduced to a few coastal enclaves. What English longbowmen had won at Crécy, an ugly Breton with a knack for avoiding open battle had systematically taken back. Bertrand du Guesclin is a one-man army in the sense that a single field commander made the difference between a France that lost the 14th century and a France that survived it. His personal record in combat was frightening on its own. He was known to fight in the front line into his 50s. He was known to prefer close-quarters mauling over cavalry charges. He was known to break the noses of English knights with his own dagger hilt during judicial duels and then sit down on the rubble of the fortress he had just captured and eat a meal. But his reputation went further. Enemies surrendered fortresses at the news that Bertrand's banner was approaching. Provinces changed hands because he was on his way. He was buried at Saint-Denis, in the cathedral where French kings were buried, and his tomb sits alongside monarchs. It is one of the very few tombs of a commoner in that basilica. France put an ugly Breton knight in the same room as its kings, because for 10 years he had held the country together, and no one, then or since, has quite figured out how one man managed to do it. Number 5. Zawisza the Black. There is a saying in the Polish language that has not gone out of use in 600 years. Polegać na nim, jak na Zawiszy. You can rely on him like you can rely on Zawisza. It is still in the Polish Scout Oath. It is still the highest compliment one Polish man can pay another. It comes from a knight named Zawisza Czarny of Garbau, who died on the banks of the Danube in 1428, doing exactly what the saying implies. He was reliable to the point of suicide, and his reliability killed him. Zawisza was born around 1379 in a small manor at Stary Garbo in southern Poland, the eldest of three brothers from a minor noble family that was not yet famous or wealthy. He was called the Black for his hair, not his armor, though he later commissioned a custom-forged suit of black plate that would eventually end up in the treasury of the Jasna Monastery in Czestochowa, where it can still be seen. He served two courts. The first was King Ladislav II of Poland, called Jagiello the Lithuanian, who converted to Catholicism and unified the crown of Poland with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The second was King Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. Between the two of them, Zawisza spent 3 decades as a knight, a diplomat, and a tournament fighter of terrifying reputation. He fought at Grunwald in 1410 in the largest cavalry battle of medieval Europe, where the Polish and Lithuanian armies broke the Teutonic Knights, a battle we have covered in full in our video on blind generals. What matters for Zawisza is that his personal reputation came out of Grunwald larger than it went in. From that point forward, he was one of the most sought-after tournament fighters in Christendom. In 1416, at the Great Council of Constance and its associated tournaments, Zawisza faced John of Aragon, considered one of the finest lists riders in Europe. Zawisza dismantled him. He rode across Europe, fighting the tournament circuit and returning home with prize money and reputation. Contemporary chronicles describe him as undefeated in the lists during the period he was active. The Hungarian court poet Adam Schwinka wrote elegies to him. The French chroniclers who covered the tournaments of the period listed him among the greatest knights of his generation. In an age when the standing of a European court was partially measured by which knight would ride in its colors, Zawisza was the knight everyone wanted. His end came from loyalty rather than defeat. In the winter of 1427, Sigismund of Luxembourg began preparing an expedition against the Ottoman Turks, who were pushing north into the Balkans. Zawisza raised a personal banner of about 500 light cavalry and joined. In the spring of 1428, Sigismund's army besieged the Danube fortress of Golubac in modern Serbia. When Ottoman relief forces approached in far greater strength than expected, Sigismund entered negotiations and began pulling his army back across the Danube. The Turks broke the truce and attacked during the crossing. Someone had to cover the retreat, or the whole army would be destroyed on the riverbank. Zawisza volunteered his 500 horsemen. Tradition preserves a conversation between him and his squire in which Zawisza said he saw no way to win, and the squire agreed that they had none. Sigismund, aware of what he was asking, sent a boat to bring Zawisza to safety before the attack landed. Zawisza refused it, with a line that has followed his name down to the present day: "There is no ship large enough to hold my honor." He turned back to his men. On the 12th of June, 1428, on the banks of the Danube, he covered the crossing of the Hungarian army. Sigismund made it across. Zawisza did not. He was either killed on the field or taken alive and executed shortly after. The Polish chronicler Jan Długosz recorded his death with a grief that reads 600 years later, as if it had been written yesterday. Sigismund wrote to Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania that knighthood itself had lost its most gallant leader. 3 of Zawisza's 4 sons would go on to die in battle. 2 of them, Marcin and Stanisław, were killed at Varna in 1444 fighting the Ottomans again. The reliability that made his name into a saying became the family curse. His symbolic tomb still stands in the Church of St. Francis of Assisi in Krakow. A monument at Golubac Fortress in Serbia commemorates him with the inscription that in Golubac in 1428, the Turks took the life of the famous Polish knight, the symbol of courage and honor, Zawisza the Black. Glory to the hero. What made Zawisza a one-man army was not raw kill count. It was the fact that having him in your line of battle was worth more than a squadron of ordinary knights. Sigismund did not send a boat for anyone else. He sent it for Zawisza because Zawisza's death was the death of a category of person. Polish soldiers grew up on his name for the next 600 years. He is still, in the 21st century, the standard against which Polish reliability is measured. And he earned that standard by refusing to get on a boat that would have carried him to safety and away from men who were depending on him. Number 4, William Marshal. In the spring of 1152, in the town of Newbury in Berkshire, a 5-year-old boy stood on a hilltop while King Stephen of England prepared to hang him. The boy was a hostage. His father, John Marshal, had promised to surrender the castle in exchange for a truce and had instead used the truce to reinforce the walls. When Stephen sent word that his son would hang if he did not surrender, John Marshal reportedly replied that he had the anvils and hammers to make more sons. King Stephen looked at the boy on the hilltop, could not do it, and eventually sent him home. The boy's name was William Marshal. He would live another 67 years, become the most feared knight in Christendom, save the English monarchy twice, and die a legend. If Stephen had gone through with the hanging, the map of England looks different today. William was born around 1147 into a minor Anglo-Norman family with no land to inherit. In his teens, he was sent to Normandy to train as a knight in the household of William de Tancarville. This was fortunate. It gave him access to the tournament circuit that had just begun to explode across northern France. Medieval tournaments were not the choreographed spectacles of Hollywood. They were violent, sometimes fatal, and profitable. Knights fought in melees with real weapons and real armor and captured each other for ransom. William turned out to be, from his very first tournament, terrifying. The number that is attached to him is 500. Over about 16 years of active tournament competition, the chronicles say William Marshal fought in roughly 500 tournaments and was unhorsed only once, and that time his horse stumbled. The number comes from the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, a biography commissioned after his death by his family, and, like all family biographies, it deserves a raised eyebrow. What is not in dispute is that he made a fortune on the circuit. Contemporary accounts describe him capturing 103 knights in a single 10-month period at the peak of his tournament career. Each ransom made him richer. Each ransom made him more famous. By the time he was in his 30s, he was one of the most talked about knights in Europe, and the Angevin royal family had noticed him. He entered the household of Henry II's eldest son, Henry the Young King, and served him until the young king's early death in 1183. He crusaded in the Holy Land. He came back and served King Henry II himself. And in 1189, during the final revolt of the sons against the aging Henry II, William did something that changed his life. In a skirmish near Le Mans, William found himself charging the future King Richard I of England, whom history calls Richard the Lionheart. Richard was in the wrong place. William had his lance couched. He could have killed him. Killing the future King of England in a family war would have been politically catastrophic, and William knew it. So he did something else. At the last moment, he lowered his lance and drove it into the neck of Richard's horse instead. The horse went down. Richard went down. Richard shouted at him, and William reportedly told him God could kill him if he wanted, but William Marshal would not. He rode off. 2 days later, Henry II was dead of natural causes, and Richard was king. Richard could have destroyed William for the humiliation. Instead, he took him into his service, married him to Isabel de Clare, the richest heiress in England, and made him Earl of Pembroke. Not killing the future king turned out to be the best investment William Marshal ever made. For the next 3 decades, William served the English crown through the reigns of Richard I, King John, and John's 9-year-old son, Henry III. He was present at Runnymede in 1215, when the barons forced John to seal Magna Carta. When John died in October 1216, England was in the middle of a French invasion. Prince Louis of France, backed by rebel English barons, had landed in Kent and was rolling up the country. The barons who remained loyal to the crown named William Marshal, then 70 years old, as Regent of England for the boy king. On the 20th of May, 1217, William led the Royalist army against the French and rebel forces at the Battle of Lincoln. He was 70. He had been ill through the winter. His household expected him to direct the battle from the rear. He called for his destrier, buckled on his armor, and rode to the front line. His horse was already at the enemy formation when a squire had to ride up and remind him to put on his helmet. So eager was he to be at the fighting. He led the charge that broke the French army in the streets of Lincoln. The rebel cause collapsed within months. Louis of France sailed home and gave up his claim to the English throne. William reissued Magna Carta later that year, cementing it as the foundation document of English constitutional law. William Marshal died on the 14th of May, 1219, at Caversham. On his deathbed, he was invested as a Knight Templar in fulfillment of a vow he had made decades before. He was buried at Temple Church in London, where his effigy still lies. He is the ancestor, through his daughter Isabel, of Robert the Bruce, and through Robert of every English monarch since James I. In practical terms, that means every king or queen of England for the last 400 years is descended from a boy King Stephen chose not to hang. What made William a one-man army was that he was the last of his kind, and he knew it. He was a knight of the pure old school, unbeatable in the lists, unshakably loyal, deadly on horseback in every decade of his life, and possessed of enough political sense to know when not to kill a future king. The English monarchy has survived some remarkably bad decisions over the centuries. It came within a hair's breadth of dying entirely in 1216, and the reason it did not is that a 70-year-old knight who had been winning tournaments since the 1160s put on his armor one more time and led the charge that saved a kingdom. Number 3, Benkei. On the 15th of June, 1189, in the northern Japanese province of Mutsu, a small residence called Koromogawa no Tate was surrounded by 500 soldiers of Fujiwara no Yasuhira. Inside the residence was Minamoto no Yoshitsutsu, one of the greatest generals of the Genpei War, now hunted by his own older brother, Yoritomo the shogun, who had come to fear his brother's popularity more than any Taira enemy. Yoshitsune had perhaps 20 retainers left. There was no reinforcement coming. Yoshitsune walked into the inner keep with his wife and infant daughter to perform seppuku. Outside, on the only bridge connecting the residence to the outside world, stood a single warrior monk who called himself Musashibo Benkei. Benkei had one job: buy his lord the time to die properly. He did. What happened at that bridge became, over the following 800 years, the definitive image of loyalty in Japanese culture. It is important to say clearly that Benkei's biography is difficult to separate from legend. The chronicles about him were mostly written after his death, and the fullest treatment, the 14th century Jikeki, is written as literary tradition rather than court record. His birth is described in fantastical terms. Some accounts say his mother was raped by a temple priest. Some say she carried him in her womb for years. Some say he was born with the teeth and hair of a demon. All of that is folklore. What the actual chronicles agree on is that Benkei was real. He was extraordinarily large for a Japanese man of the 12th century. He served as Yoshitsune's chief retainer, and he died at that bridge in a way his contemporaries described in terms that were as close to unanimous as medieval Japanese sources ever get. Benkei was born around 1155. The most famous story from his youth has him roaming Kyoto at night, hunting samurai to duel and collect their swords. He took 999 by his own count. On the 100th night, he encountered a much smaller young man on the Gojo Bridge. That young man was Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune, despite being nearly a foot shorter, defeated Benkei. Benkei, in the tradition of Japanese warrior stories, immediately became Yoshitsune's lifelong retainer. Whether the encounter happened literally the way the tradition preserves it does not matter. What matters is that from that moment until his death, 20 years later, Benkei served Yoshitsune with a loyalty that has never quite been matched in the samurai tradition. He fought alongside Yoshitsune in the Genpei War against the Taira clan. He was present at Yashima. He was present at Dan no Yura, the naval battle that ended the war. When Yoshitsune's brother Yoritomo, having become the first shogun, turned on him out of jealousy and paranoia, Benkei followed Yoshitsune into exile. For 4 years, they moved through the mountains of northern Japan, sheltered by the Fujiwara clan at Hiraizumi. When Yoritomo finally forced the Fujiwara to give them up in the spring of 1189, they had nowhere left to go. The chronicles describe the last stand in nearly identical terms across multiple sources. Yasuhira's men surrounded the temple residence on the morning of the 30th day of the 4th month. Yoshitsune retreated inside. Benkei took the bridge. He fought first with a neginata, the long-bladed polearm, associated with warrior monks. He killed everyone who tried to cross. The chronicles say he killed over 300 fully trained soldiers on that bridge. When both his arms were broken and his neginata fell, he fought on his knees with a fallen sword. When close combat had become too costly for the attackers, they pulled back and started shooting him with arrows. They emptied quiver after quiver. The chronicles compare his body to a porcupine. And still he did not fall. He remained standing at the entrance to the bridge, blocking the approach, weapon in hand, arrow riddled, refusing to move. The soldiers were afraid to close the distance. Time passed. Yoshitsune finished his rite inside the temple, and when the bravest of the attackers finally crossed the bridge and touched Benkei to see whether he was still alive, the monk fell. He had been dead for hours. His body would not fall down. This is the Benkei no Tachi Ojo, the standing death of Benkei. It is the origin story of one of the most powerful ideas in Japanese culture, that loyalty does not stop at the moment of death, that a body can continue to perform its duty even after the soul is gone. It is depicted in Ubuki, in No Theater, in Ukiyo-e Prince. In modern anime and manga, Yoshitsune himself became a folk hero. Benkei became something closer to a saint of the warrior class. There is a memorial hall at Takadachi, near the site, where they died, and the pilgrimage there has continued unbroken for 800 years. Careful modern historians point out, correctly, that the number of 300 dead attackers is almost certainly literary embellishment. The standing death itself is not corroborated by any contemporaneous court record. What is corroborated is that Benkei existed, that he was Yoshitsune's chief retainer, and that he died at the bridge of Koromogawa on the morning Yoshitsune performed seppuku. Everything else is chronicle tradition. But chronicle tradition matters. The image of a giant monk standing dead upright at the entrance to his lord's temple, arrows sticking out of him like porcupine quills, was so powerful that the Japanese state built its warrior ethic partly around it for the next 700 years. He is not a one-man army because we can prove he killed 300 men. He is a one-man army because 8 centuries of samurai grew up knowing that if you had to hold a bridge alone against 500 enemies to give your lord the time to die properly, that was a thing a human being could do. Benkei proved it. Everyone who came after him was measured against that proof. Number 2, Lu Bu. In China during the collapse of the Han Dynasty in the last decade of the 2nd century, warlords hacked at each other across a landscape of famine, plague, and civil war. It is the period that Chinese literature would later mythologize into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature. Every major figure of the period has a legendary version and a historical version. The gap between the two is nowhere wider than in the case of Lu Bu. It is worth saying up front that the demigod of the novels and the warrior in the official chronicles are not the same person, and that this list ranks the historical one. The historical Lu Bu, whose life is documented in the records of the Three Kingdoms. The official chronicle compiled by Chen Shou in the 3rd century was born around 161 in a region called Wuyuan, near what is now Inner Mongolia. He was, by the account of his contemporaries, unusually good at fighting from horseback and unusually good with a bow. He entered the service of Ding Yuan, the governor of Bing province, as a minor official. When the warlord Dong Zhuo seized control of the imperial court in 189 and began looking for a way to eliminate Ding Yuan, he bribed Lu Bu to kill his own commander. Lu Bu did it. He served Dong Zhuo for the next 3 years, was called Dong Zhuo's adopted son by the court, and was Dong Zhuo's most feared bodyguard. In 192, the court official Wang Yun conspired to have Dong Zhuo assassinated, and again Lu Bu did the killing. He murdered his second master with his own halberd inside the imperial palace. The 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms expanded these facts into pure epic. In the novel, Lu Bu is called the Flying General. He rides a horse called Red Hare so fast, it was said among men, there is Lu Bu, among horses, there is Red Hare. He carries a legendary halberd called Sky Piercer. He single-handedly duels the 3 sworn brothers Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei at Hulao Pass and holds them all off at once. He betrays Dong Zhuo because of love for the courtesan Dao Chan, one of the 4 great beauties of ancient Chinese fiction. None of these last details are in the actual historical record. The novel is one of the greatest works of Chinese literature. It is not history. Real Lu Bu had no love affair with any Diaochan. Real Lu Bu did not duel the 3 brothers at Hulao. Real Lu Bu killed Dong Zhuo because Wang Yun paid him to, and because Dong Zhuo had, on at least one occasion, thrown a halberd at Lu Bu in a rage. What the historical record does keep and this is why he ranks where he does on this list, is the incident at Yuanmen in 196. The warlord Yuan Shu sent an army under a general named Jiling to attack Liu Bei, who was then under Lu Bu's protection at Xiaopei. Lu Bu did not want the two sides to fight because a Yuan Shu victory would push Yuan Shu's influence into his own territory. He invited both Jiling and Liu Bei to a banquet at his camp. In front of everyone, he ordered his personal halberd planted upright in the ground 150 paces from the entrance of the tent. Depending on the length of a Han-era pace, 150 paces was somewhere between 190 and 225 meters. That is roughly triple the standard distance of a modern Olympic archery competition. Lu Bu then said to both generals that if he shot an arrow and struck the small side branch of the halberd blade at that distance, they would both agree to withdraw and not fight. If he missed, they could kill each other in his front yard. He drew a bow that no one else in the camp could probably even bend. He loosed a single arrow at 150 paces. It struck the halberd blade squarely. The camp went silent, and then the generals present exclaimed that Lu Bu had heavenly prowess. Jiling withdrew his army. The battle did not happen. Two warlords who had brought tens of thousands of soldiers to a border went home because one man had made an impossible bow shot. Real Lu Bu ended badly. He continued betraying his allies. He was besieged at Xiapi in 198 by the warlord Cao Cao. His own subordinates tied him up and handed him over. Cao Cao had him strangled. Whether the more famous line from the novel is real that Lu Bu begged Cao Cao to spare him, and Liu Bei quietly reminded Cao Cao about Lu Bu's habit of killing his adoptive fathers, is disputed. What is not disputed is that Cao Cao killed him. The flying general was 37. What survives is a warrior whose historical accomplishments were impressive enough that a novel with dragons in it could not really improve on them. He was strong enough that he broke the political spine of the collapsing Han dynasty twice, once by killing Ding Yuan and once by killing Dong Zhuo. He was accurate enough with a bow that he could stop a war at 150 paces with a single arrow. He was feared enough that when the novel was written 1,000 years later, the collective memory of him had grown into a demigod who could fight 3 heroes at once and always win. Warlords in the historical record were terrified of him. They did not want to face him personally. Chen Shou, writing in the 3rd century in a genre that did not encourage lyricism, wrote that Lu Bu had the courage of 10,000 men. It is a very quiet compliment for a very loud warrior. He was a one-man army because every warlord who considered attacking him did the math on what personally facing him in the field would cost and quietly went home instead. Number 1. Dioxippus. Somewhere in the eastern territories of Alexander the Great's conquering army, probably in late 326 or early 325 BC, a banquet at the king's court has turned ugly. Alexander has been drinking. His companions have been drinking. Among them is a Macedonian soldier named Choragus, one of the most distinguished veterans in the army, who has decided that his king's favor for a certain Greek athlete is intolerable. The Greek athlete is Dioxippus of Athens. He is a former Olympic pankration champion. Pankration was the most brutal event in the ancient Olympics and almost no rules, submission and striking discipline in which nothing was forbidden except biting and eye gouging, and even those rules were sometimes ignored. Dioxippus had been so dominant that in 336 BC, at the Olympic Games, no other pancratiast had dared to enter the ring against him. He had been crowned champion by default. This is called Akanidi, a victory without getting dusty. It is the only such victory recorded in the entire history of that event. Choragus, drunk and jealous, challenges Dioxippus to single combat. Dioxippus accepts. Alexander tries to talk them out of it. Both refuse. The king sets a date. Word spreads across the encampment. The Macedonians in the army rally behind their veteran. The Greeks in the army rally behind their pancratist. On the appointed day, so many spectators gathered that the ancient sources describe them as many myriads, meaning tens of thousands. It was the fight of the campaign. Choragus came out in the full panoply of a Macedonian companion. He wore a bronze cuirass and a bronze shield. He carried a sarissa, the Macedonian long pike that had smashed the Persian Empire, He carried a javelin. He carried a xiphos, the short sword the Macedonians used at close quarters. He was a walking demonstration of what the world's most successful army of the 4th century BC was equipping its best soldiers with. Dioxippus came out naked. His body was oiled. He carried a purple cloak folded over his left arm and a heavy wooden club in his right hand. His deliberate resemblance was to Heracles, the Greek hero who fought monsters with a club and wore a lion's skin. Coragus was dressed as Ares, the god of ordered warfare. Dioxippus was dressed as the mad demigod who did not need armor because he did not lose. Coragus opened at range with the javelin. Dioxippus twisted his body slightly and let it pass. Coragus advanced with the sarissa, the 6-meter pike. Dioxippus stepped inside its reach and shattered the shaft with a single blow of his club. Coragus reached for his sword. Before he could draw it, Dioxippus dropped his club, grabbed Coragus's sword wrist with his left hand, threw him to the ground with the pancration technique, and put a foot on his throat. He did not kill him. He looked to the crowd for the verdict. Coragus's life belonged to Dioxippus, and Dioxippus gave it back to him. He walked off the field. The Athenians erupted. The Macedonians did not. The Macedonian party at court could not tolerate the humiliation. In the days following, they framed Dioxippus for the theft of a golden cup at a banquet, planting one under his couch. Dioxippus understood the message the moment he saw it. He wrote a letter to Alexander explaining what had been done, went back to his quarters, and killed himself. He is remembered as one of the greatest single combat athletes of the ancient world and as one of its most tragic victims of court politics. The reason Dioxippus is at the top of this list is not the number of enemies he killed. He killed no one at this duel. He is at the top of this list because of the specific thing he demonstrated in front of tens of thousands of witnesses on a day scheduled by the most powerful man in the world. He proved that a fully armed elite professional soldier of the world's most advanced military, wearing bronze and carrying the pike that had conquered Asia, could be neutralized in under a minute by a naked man with a piece of wood. He dodged a javelin. He shattered a pike. He immobilized a swordsman before the swordsman could draw. And then he refused to kill, which was, in the context of that court on that day, the most contemptuous thing he could have done. Killing Coragus would have been an insult. Sparing him was worse. He gave back the man's life the way you give back a broken toy. What Dioxippus demonstrated was that the difference between an ordinary soldier and a genuine one-man army does not run on equipment. It runs on technique, on nerve, and on the willingness to walk toward a spear with nothing between you and it but skin. Alexander understood exactly what he had watched. The ancient sources suggest that after the fight, the king began quietly distancing himself from Dioxippus, precisely because Dioxippus had made his own best soldier look like a beginner in front of the army. The Macedonians took their revenge with a stolen cup. The Pancratiast took his exit with a knife. The image the ancient world kept was the older image, the naked man with the club standing over the armored soldier, offering the crowd a verdict on a life he had already decided to spare. Dioxippus at number 1 is a proposition about what a warrior actually is. Not the man with the best gear, not the man with the largest army behind him, the man who, on the field, in real time, has less than any of his enemies, and needs none of it. Dioxippus stood on that field with a club and a cloak, and taught the army that had beaten the Persian Empire that everything they were wearing was, at least in the case of one Athenian, decorative. That is the highest expression of a one-man army in the historical record. He was worth an army because he made an army's equipment irrelevant. These 10 warriors did not fight the same wars. They did not fight with the same weapons or in the same century. Some were duelists, some were rebels, some were the last man standing on a bridge in front of a temple where their lord was dying. What links them is the way an enemy commander adjusted his plans the moment their names came up. A warrior worth an army is not a metaphor. It is a real category of person that shows up in every military tradition, always rare, always dangerous, and always spending the rest of history being described in ways no ordinary soldier could earn. The records have to be handled with care. Most of these men were mythologized by cultures that needed heroes. Benkei's 300 kills at the bridge, Groot Pierre's shibboleth test, Lu Bu's demigod status in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, William Marshal's 500 tournaments are all numbers that come from partisan sources. What survives independent scrutiny is quieter and stranger. A pancratiast really did fight a Macedonian veteran in armor with a club and win. A Frisian farmer really did lead a rebellion the Holy Roman Emperor had to answer with a fleet. An iron hand really is on display in a German museum. A 7-foot sword really is on display in a Dutch one. A 70-year-old English regent really did charge into Lincoln in 1217 and save a kingdom. A Mapuche prisoner really did return to battle with knives lashed to the stumps where his hands had been. The core facts are strong. The details are where the ballad singers went to work. Every one of these men was eventually killed, or in Musashi's case walked into a cave, or in Götz's case died in his bed at 81. That is the last thing we're saying about warriors this dangerous. Even the ones who won all their fights lost the last one, or gave it up voluntarily. The lesson the ancient world drew from Dioxippus was that being invincible in the arena did not save him from politics. The lesson Japan drew from Benkei was that even a man who cannot fall down eventually falls. The lesson Poland has drawn from Zawisza for 6 centuries is that reliability is worth more than survival. These men were worth armies while they lived, and when they died, the armies had to figure out how to keep fighting without them. Some armies could not. If this ranking changed how you think about what a single warrior is capable of, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to push this video to more people who love real history. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into military history. And drop a comment right now. Tell us which warrior you think we ranked too low or too high. Tell us who we left off. Tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches across the entire world, and you are what keeps this channel alive. These are 10 of the deadliest fighters who ever put an army in the field by themselves. The men on this list were rare enough that most centuries did not produce even one of them. But every so often, when the odds were long enough and the moment was right, a single warrior stood on a bridge, or a beach, or a burning city wall and turned the mathematics of a whole battle. If you want to see what happens when a group of ordinary men do the same thing, backed into a corner from which no reinforcement is coming, check out our video on the greatest last stands in military history. There is one entry on that list that even Benkei would have understood.